All right, picture this for a second. You're gearing up out there at Fort Irwin, trying to wrap your head around the desert and that OPFOR when hurricane slams the Gulf Coast,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden it's you they're calling up, right? Not for your tank tactics this time, but for disaster relief. See, that's where ADP 328 comes in. It's your playbook, right? To navigate the what, the why, and the how the Army supports civil authorities, but like right here on U.S. soil.
It's almost like, you're shifting gears, like going from a huge campaign to some sort of complex peacekeeping mission. But the thing is, you're doing it all at home.
Right.
And honestly, trust me on this, grasping this doctrine, it's crucial really for any soldier.
Yeah.
And it's not just, about following orders, it's about knowing the rules. It's a whole different game.
Okay, so let's break down these rules then. We've got like a mountain of source material here on defense support to civil authorities, or DSCA, I guess, as those who love
Right.
acronyms call it. But what is it that actually sets DSCA apart from like what we'd see on a deployment overseas?
Okay, well, so picture this. You're deployed to a disaster zone, right? Here in the U.S., and you see this group, they're looting a store. Now, your gut instinct probably to intervene, right?
Yeah.
But under these DSCA rules, specifically, it's the Posse Comitatus Act. You can't just go in and start arresting people.
Yeah.
That's civilian law enforcement's job.
So it's about, even when it goes against what you've been trained to do, knowing when to hold back. That's got to be tough.
Yeah, it can be. But that's why, grasping this doctrine, it's so crucial. It's about knowing your lane, operating within, this very specific legal framework. Because confusing DSCA with, overseas deployments, that could have some serious consequences
Yeah.
for you in the mission.
I can see that. So we're really talking about a partnership here with civilian authorities not trying to, step on their toes.
Right.
Now, our source material, ADP 328, it lays out 4 core DSCA tasks. They are support for disasters, CBRN incidents, law enforcement, and other designated support. So let's unpack these a bit. What kind of real-world situations, what falls under each category?
Okay, so let's start with disasters. This is the most common DSCA scenario.
Okay.
Think Hurricane Katrina, right? Providing aid, security, even like search and rescue.
Yeah.
It's about, restoring order, getting essential services back up after some big event happens.
Got it. Okay. Now, CBRN, that's got to be intense.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's like a chemical plant explosion. You're talking containment, decontamination, medical support, and all while you're also coordinating with like civilian HAC-MAT teams, first responders. It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Okay. How about support to law enforcement? What's that look like practically?
Think back to the civil unrest, a few years back.
Okay.
You could be called in to provide security at, key infrastructure, maybe help set up a perimeter, or even just be a visible presence to kind of deter further unrest.
Right.
But remember, no arresting people, no conducting investigations. That's crossing the line.
Yeah, staying in your lane. Got it. Okay, now, other designated support, that's really broad. What even falls under that?
You can think of it as that, like the catch-all category.
Right.
Like providing security for a huge event, like the Olympics, helping out with logistics during a pandemic, even supporting like the Secret Service during a presidential visit. It's about being flexible, ready for anything.
So we've got the what of DSCA, the tasks.
Yeah.
But ADP 328 also lays out like 6 core purposes, right? Why is the Army involved in these domestic operations to begin with?
Right. It's not just about, showing up. It's about achieving certain objectives. We're talking saving lives, obviously, but then also restoring those essential services, power, water, that kind of thing, protecting infrastructure, even helping local governments get back on their feet. It's a holistic approach to crisis response.
Yeah, so it's a lot more nuanced than just like sending in the troops.
Absolutely.
Which is why, understanding these legal constraints we were talking about before, so important.
Right.
And speaking of legal constraints, we really need to get into this Posse Comitatus Act a bit deeper.
Okay, this Posse Comitatus Act, it sounds like something, I don't know, straight out of a history book,
Yeah.
But you're saying it's super relevant for today's soldiers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's about as old as like the Wild West, but trust me, it's still relevant today, especially when we're talking DSCA. Think of it like this. The Posse Comitatus Act, it's like the guardrail to keep the military from becoming the police, right?
It keeps a very clear separation of powers between civilian law enforcement and the armed forces.
So, no, like rounding up outlaws on horseback, like in the old days.
Not quite, no.
Okay.
I mean, we've traded horses for Humvees these days, but the idea is the same. It's there to protect those civil liberties, right?
Right.
Make sure the military, it's being used appropriately, here on U.S. soil.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. But can you give me like a more concrete example? Like how does this actually play out in a real world DSCA situation?
Okay, so let's say, you're deployed to a city after a big earthquake,
Right.
right? Widespread damage, people are desperate,
Hmm.
and you see these looters, they're breaking into a pharmacy. What do you do?
Well, my gut says stop them, but I mean, knowing what I know now about this Posse Comitatus Act, I'm thinking that's probably a no-go, right?
Ex You're right, yeah, your instinct to protect, that's right, but you can't just start arresting people, right? You need to coordinate with the local police.
Mhm.
They're the ones with the legal authority to handle law enforcement. Your role is to support them, not replace them.
So it's about knowing those boundaries, even in a chaotic situation. But I'm guessing there are like exceptions to this rule, right? Like if national security is at stake, I mean, the military can step in then, right?
You're right. Yeah,
Yeah.
there are a few limited exceptions. If it's a real, national security emergency, we're talking like a terrorist attack with WMDs or a full-blown insurrection, then Posse Comitatus Act, it can be set aside to allow for more, I guess, direct military intervention. But those are extreme situations, and even then, it's a decision that's going all the way up to, the top of the chain of command.
Okay, so those exceptions they're definitely the exception, not the rule.
Right.
It seems like the big takeaway here is to know your lane and work within those legal boundaries.
Exactly.
Now, the source material, it also talks about, the different roles of the regular Army, the Army Reserve, and the National Guard in these DSCA situations.
Right.
Can you break down who does what in these cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of it like this. The regular army, they're like your heavy hitter, right?
Okay.
They bring the big guns, literally, figuratively. They've got the manpower, the equipment, and the logistics to really sustain those large-scale operations for a long time if they need to. So if it's a major hurricane, a massive earthquake, really any event that just overwhelms those local and state resources, that's when the regular army, they're probably going to be your go-to.
Okay, so if it's a big one, regular Army steps in. Got it.
Right.
And what about the reserves? Where do they fit into this whole thing?
So the reserves, they're all about specialized support, right? They're like your go-to team for those specific skill sets. You need a bridge built. You call in the engineers. Need medical support. They got you covered. And they train for this, and they're ready to deploy really quickly to augment the regular army or even just support those civilian agencies directly.
Was like having that toolbox full of like specialized tools,
Yeah,
each with a specific purpose. That's a great analogy.
thanks.
So they're the specialists. They're ready to jump in with their unique skills. And finally, we've got the National Guard. It seems like, they're always on the front lines when something happens here in the U.S.
Right.
And there's got to be a reason for that, right?
Yeah,
Ben?
and there is. The National Guard, they have that dual role to serve, both their state and the nation.
Right.
And they're embedded in communities all across the country. So they're often, the first responders during these domestic emergencies, right? They know the local area. They already have those relationships with the local authorities, and they're ready to respond immediately to the governor's orders.
Right. Yeah, I remember seeing the National Guard all over after Hurricane Katrina. They were distributing supplies, directing traffic.
Yeah.
They were everywhere. So
Yeah.
they've got that local connection, which is so key in those situations. But they can also be federalized if they need to be, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the president issues the order, then the National Guard, they come under federal control, to support those larger operations.
Mhm.
That dual role, it makes them really versatile and super valuable in these DSCA situations.
Okay, so we've got these three components. Each one's got its own strengths, its own responsibilities.
Yeah.
It seems like smooth coordination between all of them, it's got to be crucial if these DSCA operations are going to be effective at all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're talking multiple agencies, different chains of command, and the situation's always changing. It's like conducting an orchestra. Everyone's going to be playing the same tune, and it's just not going to work.
Yeah, interoperability, that's the key word there.
Right. Bingo.
Okay.
Yeah. Being able to communicate well, coordinate, operate, and do it all smoothly with those other military branches and the civilian agencies, it is critical if you want DSCA to be successful. Now, speaking of different chains of command, we really need to address this whole duty status thing.
Yeah.
It can get kind of confusing,
Yeah.
especially for those in the National Guard.
Yeah, duty status, that's one of those things that always makes my head spin a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us? Why is it such a big deal, especially in the context of DSCA? So, duty status, it's one of those things that, it might seem like just a technicality, right? Until, of course, you're like right there in the thick of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Like, picture this. You're a National Guard soldier. You're deployed to help out with hurricane relief, right? Everything's chaos. And then you get this order to go secure a local armory. They're using it to, like, distribute supplies. Sounds easy enough, right? But here's the thing. Depending on what your duty status is, like whether you're operating under Title 10, Title 32, or state active duty, that order, that could have some pretty big legal implications.
Okay, so yeah, I'm starting to see why this is a big deal then. It's not just about, following orders. It's about really understanding the legal side of those orders.
Right.
So let's break it down a little bit. What are the main differences between these duty statuses, and why should the soldier on the ground, why should they even care?
Okay, so let's start with Title 10. This is like what most people think of when they, when they picture the military.
Not,
right?
yeah.
You're under federal control, taking orders straight from the president. And your mission, it's usually tied to national defense. Like think deployments overseas or responding to, a huge terrorist attack, something like that.
Okay, got it. So Title 10, federal control, national level missions.
Right.
What about Title 32? You said that one gets a little tricky, especially I guess for the National Guard.
Right. Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. So under Title 32, the National Guard, they're still under their state governor's command.
Okay.
But they can be called up to support, federal missions. It
Hey.
might be, they might be training for a future deployment or maybe assisting with, border security, something like that. The key here is that they're ultimately accountable to their state's chain of command.
So same force, different boss. Just depends on the situation.
Exactly.
Okay. What about that third status then? State active duty.
Right.
That's the one that's like purely state level, right?
Exactly. Think of it as like your hometown heroes. They're, springing into action.
Right.
A tornado maybe rips through a town, or a wildfire, rages out of control. Or if there's like major civil unrest, the governor can activate the National Guard under this state active duty to go respond to these emergencies. And they report directly to the governor, and their authority, it's limited to that state's borders.
Okay, so we've got our 3 different duty statuses, each one with its own chain of command, each one with its own like scope of authority. What's like the key takeaway for our listeners here? Why does all this even matter?
It matters because it really directly impacts like your legal protections and also your responsibilities as a soldier. If you're operating under Title 10, what you're doing is covered under federal law. But if you're, under Title 32 or state active duty, then you might be subject to different rules of engagement, different legal liabilities. Knowing where you stand, it is critical.
So ignorance is not bliss when we're talking about duty status.
Not at all. It's about, protecting yourself and making sure you're operating within the law. And that brings us to another really critical part of DSCA, personal liability.
Okay.
Our source material, ADP 328, it makes it really clear that while, there are these legal protections in place for soldiers who are acting in good faith, there are definitely limits.
Right. It's not a get out of jail free card.
Right.
So under what circumstances could a soldier face, like personal liability during a DSCA operation?
It all comes down to negligence and then acting outside, like your authority. If you're following orders, if you're, operating within your training, within the parameters of your duty status and you're acting responsibly, you're generally going to be protected. But if you're reckless, if you disobey orders or you exceed your authority, like let's say you decide to like detain someone unlawfully, then you could be held responsible for what you did personally.
It's like that old Spider-Man quote, right?
Yeah.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay, I think we've really hammered down the legal stuff here.
Yeah.
But there's one more part of DSCA I want to touch on before we wrap this up, and that's religious support.
Okay.
It might seem like, I don't know, a weird thing to consider.
Yeah.
But it's in the source material for a reason, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's an area where things can get, ethically complicated really quickly. Imagine You're deployed to, to a community. It's been devastated by a hurricane. People are hurting. They've lost everything. They're looking for some kind of comfort, maybe even some spiritual guidance. You might be tempted to offer that, right?
Right.
But as a soldier, and especially as a chaplain, you gotta be really careful here.
Right, right. We don't want to blur those lines between, church and state, especially in those really vulnerable moments. So how does the Army even approach this? What does like religious support even look like during DSCA?
It's all about, finding that balance
Hmm.
between providing that support, but also respecting that separation of church and state. The main role of military chaplains during DSCA, it's to support those military personnel and their families.
Right.
They're there to provide that spiritual guidance, some counseling, just a listening ear
Yeah.
for those who are, dealing with the stress and the trauma that comes with a disaster.
Okay, so they're there for our soldiers, which makes sense. But
Oh.
what about the civilians, like the ones who might be, looking for that spiritual guidance? Does the doctrine even address that at all?
It does, yeah. ADP 328, it lays out this very specific four-pronged test to figure out when it's okay for for chaplains to provide that support to civilians. It basically boils down to, is there like an urgent need? Are those civilian resources just overwhelmed? Is the support, like, is it temporary and non-denominational? And then finally, is it, really essential to preserving life or preventing suffering?
So it's a pretty high bar to clear then.
It is.
Seems like the Army is really cautious about like crossing those lines.
And rightfully so. It's about, meeting a need without forcing beliefs on anyone. For example, a chaplain, they might, offer a non-denominational prayer at like a community gathering, or maybe help organize volunteers, from different faiths to help out with the relief effort. But they wouldn't be like leading religious
Yeah.
services or trying to convert anyone.
It's definitely a delicate balance.
Yeah.
Well, we have covered a ton of ground today, from like the very basics of those DSCA tasks to like the really complicated legal and ethical considerations. So, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what are some like key takeaways you're hoping our listeners, they walk away with?
I think the biggest one is just this. DSCA, it's not like just another deployment,
Yeah.
It's a really unique environment with its own set of rules, its own challenges, but also its own, its own opportunities.
Mm.
Knowing the doctrine, understanding your specific role, and then, staying in your lane, that is mission critical for the mission to be successful, but also for you to protect yourself, legally.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping our listeners, they also come away from this with, a much deeper appreciation for just how complex DSCA really is. It's not as straightforward as it might seem, just looking at it.
Not at all. There's a lot of nuance here. It's about knowing when to step up, when to, like you said, stay back, and how to deal with those really gray areas, ethically, but also effectively.
Mhm.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it. To our listeners, keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, be ready, because, when disaster strikes, you just might be the one that they call. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into ADP 328, and until next time, stay safe out there.